You're still up here, Tim. I'll tell you what, I've been gone for almost 2 months, which is absolutely insane to me. I like to take all my vacation all at once, and then I try not to check my email the whole time so that I can totally check out. At least that's what I try to do. I don't do it always successful. But one of the things I absolutely love about this church is that I can step away for a little while and come back and trust not only that it's going to be in God's care, but also I love to see that there's just an incredible staff that's here, an incredible group of leaders and volunteers that keep this place running. It just blows my mind how faithful God is to this place and how committed you've been to it. And so as a pastor, the fact that I can leave and trust that it's okay is just a tremendous gift. And I'm so, so thankful when I come back and just to see so many smiling faces and people that I absolutely love. The experience is amazing. I just want you to know that. The other thing I'll say is I want to just tell you what I did while I was gone, because otherwise I have to do it 200, 300 times if I don't do it here in front of everyone. The first week I was in Honduras, right, with our mission team. And so that seems like forever ago. That was like back in May. And then I immediately jumped on a plane with my wife and my almost 3-year-old and 3-month-old. And that was quite an experience flying across the country to Seattle with them. I'm not going to do it again for a while, and I'm really thankful because it's miserable flying with little kids. But we got there. Both of our parents, my family and Jen's family, is from Seattle. And so we got over there. We spent 3 weeks with her family. We spent 3 weeks with my family, and we enjoy our time with them so much. I just got back from about 10 days in Switzerland where I did a wedding for one of our church folks. It was absolutely beautiful, and since they paid for my flight, I took advantage of being over there and did some hiking for a week and some reading and reflecting and praying. And I just got back last night, and boom, here I am in front of, on a stage. It's so weird. But I hope you'll just be patient with me as I get back in a saddle and figure things out. I'm so thankful to be here with you this morning. The text that I'm going to read in a minute is from Psalm 105, and I remember the coffee shop I was sitting in Seattle when I picked it and sent it in an email to John. And so that's where we're going to pick up in a minute. And what we're going to talk about today is the concept of story and how we find that in Psalm 105. But before we get there, let me just tell you a little bit about a pastor trick that I have. So pastors are like Jedis, and they have special tricks. And one of the tricks is whenever you meet someone, you have to get to the heart of whatever it is really fast. I remember when I was a hospital chaplain for a summer, sometimes I would only have 3 to 10 minutes maybe with someone ever, maybe before they died. And you had to find a way in that short moment of time to find the deepest way possible to talk about what was on their heart. Usually when you meet people, you say, hey, how's it going? How's it going? Good. All right, good. Yeah, are you busy? Oh, yeah, totally busy. All right, good to see you. Bye. That's the depth of our conversation. But one of the things that I try and do when I have a chance is use whatever time I have with someone to get to the heart of whatever the most important things are as quickly as possible. And that's not an easy thing to do. And so whenever I meet someone, I always ask them the same question. And whenever I meet someone, I don't say, hey, what's your name? Or what are you doing? Or what's going on with your life? Or how's the weather? Or what's your favorite sports team? All the things that you could ask when you meet someone, right? I always say, hey, what's your story? It's a cool trick. Because whenever you ask someone what their story is, you have no idea what they're going to say next. One of the things that I try not to do is ever ask someone what their job is, because so many people define their identity by what they do for a living. Or sometimes I'll say, where are you from? But where you're from isn't your total identity either. We're not defined by the places necessarily we were born, or how much money we make, or how important we are, or what our friends are, or any of that stuff. But whenever I say, what's your story, it creates this weird open space where people get to say whatever they think they are. And the things that come out of, usually there's this moment of well, how can I just tell you my story in 1 second? But it's amazing what opportunities open up when you let someone define what their story is. What's your story? If you had a minute, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5 minutes to turn to your neighbor and tell them your story, what would you say? You don't have to do it. But what would you say your story is? Everybody has one. One of my favorite editorialists in the New York Times is David Brooks. He wrote an incredible book on character and virtue. I remember every single word of it because I remember I was walking the Camino de Santiago in Spain when I was listening to the audiobook version. But he's an editorialist for the New York Times, and he recently wrote an article just a week or so ago where he talked about the importance of story and your story and how that defines you and how important it is. especially in politics these days. This is what he wrote, and we're going to apply it to us in just a little bit. But he said that one of the reasons why Donald Trump won the election a couple years ago was because he was able to tell a story that a lot of people connected to. So tell me if you recognize this. This is his story that he told, is that middle-class America is full of good-hearted, decent people who've been screwed by stupid elites or Washington and are threatened by foreigners who are out to destroy our way of life. That was like one of the narratives and the stories that he told, not necessarily the details. What's funny is no one really cares about the details if they get the story right, he says. And that was the story that he told that connected with a lot of people. And in the midst of our political climate these days, different Democrats are trying to make up new stories that will connect with people so that they can get reelected. Here are some of the examples that he gave. He said, Democrats have told many stories over the years. For example, that too many Americans are poor and marginalized and left behind, and we have to care for everybody because we're one family. That's a story that's often told by politicians. Another one, Bernie Sanders, who recently ran for the presidency. This was his story that he tried to tell. He said America is divided by class conflict. Bankers and the powerful elites are exploiting the middle class and the poor, and we need a fighter to go out and battle these controversial figures. At least that was the story that he told that tried to connect with a generation of people. Another example, and this one's very common as well, a story that's being told, is that America has been marked by systems of oppression, especially women, African Americans, and Latinos, and that we need to stand together and fight for justice. Here's what I want you to understand. Is that in order to have influence, what you need is a story that connects with people. If you stand up and start going over policy details of every little thing you're going to change and how you're going to get it done, that's not what wins elections. What wins elections is whether you can tell a story that people can connect to. Because that is, at the end of the day, how we as people are made, is to tell stories, to be defined by stories. And it's powerful how that works. Even advertising companies know how this works. Nike, when you see a Nike commercial on television, they do not start their commercial by telling you how impressive their sneaker is and detailing all the little parts of the rubber and how they were able to get this to work and that to work in order to make the best shoe possible. They don't tell you any details about their shoe. Instead, what they do is they paint a picture for us and say, hey, if I wear these shoes, I can look like that and be victorious and become fit and be the person I've always wanted to be. And so they connect their shoe or a product to a larger story of who we want to be. There's never any commercials anymore that tell us the details of a product. It's always about inviting us to be a part of a big story, and somehow their product wraps into that. Whether you know it or not, the stories are being told to you every single day. And you and I have options on what stories we want to be a part of and which ones we think are true and how all that works. And that's where we get to Psalm 105. The Jewish people in this psalm are telling a story of who they are and what's the most important story in their existence. One of the things that's important to remember is for the Jewish people, man, they had more stories of chapters in their story of ups and downs than anyone you'll ever meet. And so we think Psalm 105 was written, maybe in the middle of the 4th or 5th century BC. But this was an oral tradition that was passed along among the Jewish people for well over 1,000 years by the time it was written down. And so in a pre-literate culture, telling stories was extremely important. And so I'm going to read you for just a minute what their story was. And it's going to take a little bit, and so just follow with me for a little bit. But what they do here is they tell their story. This Psalm 105 is read at the beginning of Passover every year in the Jewish tradition. So I'll read it. So here we go. The first part's just kind of an intro. It says, "Give praise to the Lord, proclaim his name. Make known among the nations what he's done. Sing to him, sing praise to him. Tell of his wonderful acts. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Look to the Lord in his strength. Remember his face always." All right, so this is where it gets interesting, and they start telling a story. "Remember the wonders he's done, his miracles and the judgments he pronounced. You, his servants, the descendants of Abraham, his chosen ones, the children of Jacob. He is the Lord our God, and his judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant forever, the promise he made for 1,000 generations, the covenant he made with Abraham, the oath he swore to Isaac." See what they're doing? They're telling the story of all the things that have happened in the first 5 chapters of the Bible. "He confirmed it to Jacob as a decree, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. To you I'll give the land of Canaan as the portion you will inherit. And when they were few in number, few indeed, but strangers in it, They wandered from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another. He allowed no one to oppress them. For their sake, he rebuked kings. Do not touch my anointed ones. Do my prophets no harm. He called down famine on the land, destroyed all the supplies of food, and he sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with shackles, and his neck was put in irons, till what he foretold came to pass, till the word of the Lord proved him true. And it goes on and on throughout Israel's history to describe the kings and then what happens next. And this is why, when you and I read this, we just sort of like, okay, that's a cool psalm. Really nice. It retells a story that you can read in other parts of the Bible, and I don't understand why I have to read this today or why this is important. And it's really difficult to understand why it was if you don't know a little context. What they were doing here in this psalm is they were writing down who they are. They're writing down what their story is. So if you asked any Jewish person what their story is, they don't say, oh, I'm a carpenter. Oh, what's your story? Oh, I'm married to this person, or this is how much I weigh, or this is my diagnosis, or this is what I'm struggling with today. If you said, hey, what's your story? The person would have said, oh, I'm a part of a chosen people. From way back far ago that God decided he was going to intervene with my father Abraham. I've done Ancestry.com and I can go back a little bit far. These folks are thousands of years removed and they claim who their ancestors are. They say, this is who I am. This is whose I am. This is my story, and it defines every single part of me. That is a crazy thing, right? We don't have much like that today. And whenever I ask someone what's their story, they never talk about their grandparents very often or their great-great-grandparents. Folks usually don't even talk about their faith. So whenever I ask you, what's your story, do you have any depth to it, or what's in your story? I just want to take a couple moments today to slow down and help us think about what our story is, or what your story could be. One of the things I love about the Psalms, and especially about the Old Testament, I was actually on a train with someone just last week somewhere in Switzerland who said, the Old Testament's terrible. It's just all these stories of brutal killing and all these horrible things. But one of the things that I always point out about it that I hope you'll appreciate in a new way is when every ancient culture, especially in the ancient Near East, was writing their story, and you can find pharaohs and kings that have these big pillars all throughout, and you'll find them in museums throughout Europe and throughout the Near East, ancient Near East. You find these big pillars of kings that tell their stories. And what do they always say? I conquered this person here, and then I ripped their head off here, and then this is what I did, and then this is how many things I conquered, and then I died on this day, and then it's all about your victories. One of the things I love about the Old Testament, and especially about the Hebrew Scriptures here, is that when they tell their story, they tell it brutally honest. God did this for us. We did a good job here, and we utterly failed here. The Old Testament's the only place where you'll find a king talking about how he murdered someone and regretted it, and then prayed on the ground with his just tears falling out. It's an honest story. And that's what I love about it when I read it. But there's a lot of other stories that could be your story. For example, in the ancient Near East, there were some other stories that defined who you were and whose you are. For the Jewish people, their story is that there's a God who made the universe, who isn't crazy, and who's love. That he chooses people, and he comes down and he gives them purpose and meaning, and is faithful to them beyond all generations. Faithful even to me. That was their story, and that was the story that they continued to tell to their children and tell their children's children. But there were a lot of other options back then, and that exist today as well. One of them is that the gods are crazy, and there's a lot of them, and that you are powerless as a human being. Like, for example, if you were a Greek person living in Jesus' day or in Paul's day, one of the stories that went around was, well, the reason why everything's happening is because the gods up there are fighting. And so when it rains, it's because this god did this. And if you get pregnant or not, it's because this god likes you. And maybe you did the right sacrifice. But the gods were unruly and crazy, and you couldn't control them. And whatever they did dictated what happened to life on earth. That was like the way they viewed the world. Have you heard of that before? That was a common view of the world. And that was a story that people had that helped them make sense of how the world works. Another story that was out there is that the world is just atoms, and that you're an animal, and that what you see is what you get. There were some Greek philosophers in Jesus' day who believed this, who thought that all there was in the world, there isn't any gods, there isn't any purpose, there isn't any meaning to life. Instead, the only thing that's really real is the things you can touch and feel with your hands and see with your eyes. That's what's really real. Atomism, or today we call it scientific naturalism, is a worldview that believes that when you die, and there's nothing else, and you just become worms and dirt. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Now that's the last word in that narrative. Stephen Hawking, for example, or different scientists often have this belief, and even in our modern culture today, that story is very prevalent, that all there is in this world is atoms and science, and that's the sum total of who we are. That's one story. Is that what's true? There's another story that said that what we need to do is follow our leaders, who are God's representatives on earth, and if you obey them, that you'll have a good life. And so if you were growing up in Egypt, you believed that there were gods, but that Pharaoh was like God on earth, and if you just followed Pharaoh, everything was going to be okay for you, or at least that's the story that they told. That was an extremely common story. Not the Jewish story, though. They believed that God was God and that every single person on earth can fail. We see this even today. There's a lot of people that put a little too much faith in leaders, sometimes in pastors or in politicians or in authors or anyone else. One of the things that we've seen, at least over the last year or two, is, well, it happens all the time, but we've seen more leaders and famous people come to a crash burn end, I think, in the last few years than almost any time since I've been alive, which isn't very long, but still. The idea is this, is that when we build people up, and follow them as if we're going to put all our hopes and dreams that they can deliver us and that they can save us and that they can help us. Usually that story doesn't work out, but it's a common story that you hear. I have two more. One is this, is that there's no overarching purpose to life, so you might as well enjoy it as good as you can. That was a famous story that was told by Greek hedonists, and so in Jesus' day, they were a group of philosophers that says the good life is one where you're just happy. And so in our culture, one of the idols that we have is fun. If it's not fun, it's not good. And so whenever we try to convince our daughter to do something, or maybe our son someday, if we tell them that it's going to be fun, then they're like, oh, well, then that's okay. Because that's what I do. My whole life is all about fun. If it's fun, it's good. If it's not fun, it's bad. And so we define the good life as one that brings us pleasure. And so those bumper stickers that I saw growing up that said, the one who dies with the most toys wins, that's someone who's telling a story that says life is what you can make it for yourself, and the more experiences and happiness you can bring, that's what good is. Is that a true story or not, though? I don't know. It's one of the stories that we tell. And the last one, there's many more, but this is another one. This was Manichaeism back in the day, that the evil and good are equal and opposing forces, and you just want to line yourself up with the best one. Yin and yang is a little bit like this, especially in Taoist religions, where you would see like good and bad are always fighting against one another, and that you have the option every day to line up with whatever one you want. And maybe at the end of this life, you'll be reincarnated, or it goes on or not. I'm not sure what the different view is. But one of the views of the world was just that, we're in the middle of this epic war, and that we every day get to decide what part or side of the war that we're on. Anyway, here's my point. There's all these different stories. There's like thousands of different stories. Which one is true? Do you know? Is there any one of those stories that lines up with you? If I asked you what's your story, would you have been able to say any of those, or do any of them line up with your heart? One of the things that I read recently is there was a book called Emotional Agility by Susan David, who has this TED Talk that's epic, and it has millions of views. And one of the things that she said is the stories that people tell themselves often end up defining who they are. So the story actually has this, it may or may not be true out there, but it actually has an impact on who you are. For example, if you always tell yourself every single day that you are a failure, that there's no hope for you, and that even the good breaks that you have aren't going to be good for you because somehow the universe is against you and there's no hope. Well, studies show that if you believe that that's a true story about who you are, that will actually happen. So even though the evidence may be contrary against it, like let's say this person gets a promotion or finds a beautiful person who loves them or has all these good things come their way, eventually that person will lose all those things or quit that job because somehow their belief about who they are becomes true. If you believe that there's no way you'll ever meet someone who loves you, it's very possible that that'll happen because that story that you've told yourself will have an impact on you deep into your core. If you've always told yourself that there's no hope for you, that this is the end, or that habit or that addiction or that thing that's going on in your life is who you are and that you're powerless to stop it, if that's the story you tell yourself, then that story will become who you are. It's really important for us to know what our story is because the story has an impact on shaping our identity and our future. So I'm going to ask you one more time, what's your story? You better have a good one. Not because you want one because it's fun, but because if you don't have one, it means you're going to be lost. If you don't have a story, you'll never know where you are. And the story that is deep inside you, whatever it is going to shape you in ways that you may or may not know. You know, for folks that come from divorced families, you know, the studies are just off the charts of how much more likely it is for you to get divorced. And the reason why is because that's a part of your story. This is who I am. This is what's normal. This is how things work. If you come from a family that has terrible financial, practices in it, the chances are that you as a kid, you're going to adopt all of that and inherit that. And unless you have a different story, that story is going to become your own. It's always so scary how much we become like our parents. The stories get transferred over and over. I do want to say this. One of the things that's difficult for us when we read this passage in Psalm 105 is, as folks that live in 21st century United States, we're used to having our story be all about me. Like, my story is about me. But for the Jewish people, they understood their story collectively. And they understood their story to take place over generations. Whenever I tell my story, I want it to be all about me. It starts when I'm born and it ends when I die. But the truth is I'm a part of a much bigger story than just my own little life. You know, I'm a husband and a son and a father. I'm also a part of a country. So I'm a part of, like, somehow this country. The story of the United States is partially my story. You know, so I'm connected to all these bigger stories. I don't know what your stories are connected to. One of the things I would challenge you to think about is that you are more than just who you think you are. You are so deeply connected to so many different things that unless you spend time reflecting on what your story is, you're going to be missing out on discovering who you really are. So for the Jewish people, it was really important to tell their story. And this is why, in my opinion. Because not only did they believe their story was true, i.e. when they go back in time, they're not making things up. It's really important. If you just tell a story to yourself that's fake, eventually when it gets challenged, you're going to let go of it. So if you tell yourself that you are an amazing athlete and you're not, and you just try and make up a story for yourself, you might be able to make it for a little bit, but eventually reality will kind of bring you back and start to shape your story in a different way. So you don't get to make up your story. The Jews actually believed that this story that they told in Psalm 105 of how God had chosen them and been faithful to them and had spoken to their ancestors and was guiding them even today, they really believed that it was true. As a Christian, whenever I tell the story of Easter, or I tell the story of how the Holy Spirit continues to work in different places, one of the things that's important is I don't just tell it as a story that's a myth that isn't real. A lot of Christians get nervous about the word story because they think that that means it may or may not be true. But a story has to be true, and it has power if it is. Now, here's what was powerful for the Israelites. Their story helped get them through life and tell them who they were in a couple different ways. One is it told them that they weren't an accident. The Jewish people were never important. You know, now we think that they are, like many years later. But back in the olden days, they were like a small little country in the middle of nowhere. While I was on vacation, I read this book called Jerusalem, and it was just a history of the city of Jerusalem over many centuries. Man, the Jews got kicked in and out of everywhere they lived throughout history more than anyone I've ever heard. They were hardly ever the leaders or the winners of battles. It's an incredible thing, but somehow a part of their story was never about, hey, we're victorious, or we are always going to be important, or win this or win that. Instead, their story was, we are important and we have value because the God of the universe loves us. So no matter how good their day was or how bad their day was, whether they were winning or retreating, they never felt like they were worthless people because their story told them that the God of the universe was always on their side. I mean, a lot of folks who don't know if there's a God, or who especially don't know if God's good. One of the things that I can tell you, though, is that if it's true that there is a God and that God loves you and is for you, when you wake up in the morning, you're a different person. I wake up different knowing that there's hope and there's potential, and knowing that, like, the God of the universe, the spirit of the world who is active and at work every single day in our lives, is actually on my side. It changes how I see the world. And the Jewish people believed this. It was a part of their story. I believe that because Jesus came and rose from the dead, that there is an incredible power and hope for me that exists. That story impacts me and changes my life on a day-to-day basis. For the Jewish people, they also believed that they had a purpose, that this world wasn't just a random accident. And I will say this, one of the things that's really challenging is You may be in the middle of a very difficult thing, and I don't know what that thing is. It may be a diagnosis or jobs or homelessness, or I'm not sure what your issue is. But the Jewish people always believed that God was in control of the world. That's part of their story. And what that meant is that each individual chapter wasn't the end of the book. There have been times in my life where, I would look into the future and all I could see was failure or something terrible. Because I could only see like this far beyond where I was that day. And that's a scary thing. But if you have a story that tells you that God exists and is on your side and is in control of the world, then what that means is the chapter that you're in isn't the end of the story. It's a powerful idea that whenever we're in the midst of a controversy, whenever your marriage is starting to tank, or you feel like you have no hope to find someone that you love, or maybe that you're never going to find the right job that you want, or I don't know what your story is or where you are in it. Here's what I can tell you, is that that's not the end of your story. I really do believe that God loves you and is on your side and will see you through the difficult thing. It makes a big difference what you believe is true about the world and what story is active in your mind when you're hearing these things. Friends, I could go on, but here's what I would ask you to do. If I asked you, what's your story, what would you say? Like you had 3 minutes to turn to your neighbor and tell them your story. Now, I'm just gonna try for a second to tell you what my story is as a way to help teach people, I guess, how you do it. So I was born on a dark and stormy night. Just teasing, no. So this is my story, and I'm sure it's like a lot of you guys. I grew up I thought I was a good kid, and I was like JJ, pretty good kid. My parents sometimes brought me to church, and I did my best to get through life, and I was pretty successful in what I tried to do. And as I was growing up, one of the things that I found in my life was that no matter how successful I was, there was always something that was missing. There was always more I wanted or something else in my life. And this is my story, is that I remember where I was sitting the day I gave my life to God and said, God, I want you to do something with my life. I was sitting on a dock, and I was kind of at the end of my rock bottom is the best place you can ever possibly be, because it's the place where things turn around. And I remember when I hit rock bottom in my life, and like for the first time I said, God, I have no idea if you're real, but I'm going to try to follow you with my life. That's crazy to me, but that particular day in my life was one of the defining moments of my story. And then when I gave my life to God, I didn't know how things worked, and I was kind of the same person, and I didn't really know how things were going to go. What's so weird to me is that now my story is I ended up studying theology for over a decade, and my first job was as a pastor in Miami. Like, you have no idea how weird that is to me. I wasn't from a family of pastors. My family wasn't super religious anyway, but for some reason, I felt like the God of the universe loved me and was on my side and was calling me to do something incredible. When I look back on my life, I see how God has been active in every little moment, that nothing's really an accident, that all the micro conversations I have with people are there for a reason, and that the things that happen in my life, even the darkest and the heavy and the hard parts, God's been able to use to shape me into who I am and who He wants me to be. What's your story? I was just talking to someone before the church service who's a part of our history committee, and we've got archives on the 3rd floor of the building up there with like 100 plus years of documents from this church. And we were reflecting about how, isn't it amazing how this church has had so many ups and downs and then really bad downs. And then another really bad one after that. And isn't it amazing that we're still here this morning praising God? It's amazing to have a story. So, what's yours? I hope and pray that the story of the Scriptures, that there's a God who's for you and that loves you, that has a purpose for your life, that's calling you to do great things, and that will see you through all the difficult things. If you allow that story to be your story, you will have more joy and peace in your life and be connected to God in a deeper way than you could ever imagine. My prayer for you and for me is that story will dwell deeply in our hearts. The Jewish people, the most important chapter in their Bible is Deuteronomy 6. It says, love the Lord your God. This is the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That's the most important part. And then right after that, no one quotes the next verse. It says, and tell that to your children. Write it on your foreheads and on your arms, and that's why Jewish people have phylacteries where they actually wear it sometimes on certain days if they're very, very conservative and religious and those kinds of things. But if you know your story, tell it to yourself. When you wake up in the morning, remind yourself of who you are and what your story is. When you talk to your children, remind them of what their story is. My little girl, she's gorgeous. And, all it's going to take is for one boy someday to come along and start telling her a different story and take her in a different way. And so every day when I see her, the first things out of my mouth are, oh, Gracie, Daddy loves you. You are so beautiful. Every time I see her, I tell her how smart she is. I know she's going to grow up in a world that tells her that she's probably not pretty enough, or that she's not going to be as smart as other people, or maybe as successful, or do all these things. We tell ourselves that we're not good enough. And so that's why as a parent, one of the things that I have to do to my daughter, even to myself, is to remind myself constantly what's true. And tell the stories that are more deep and more real than anything else. And the deepest, most real story is that our salvation is in God's love, that He has a plan for your life, and He's on your side. If you believe that, things can change. Will you pray with me? Lord, we're so thankful to be a part of your story. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for seeing us through difficult times. For those of us that are in a really good chapter of our lives right now, we give you thanks for the ways that you've been so good to us. And for those of us who are hurting and in pain and don't know if we can make it, help remind us that there's another chapter coming and that your work in our lives is not done. Thank you for your faithfulness to see us through this whole thing. And may your Son, Jesus Christ, come again and bring this wonderful story to conclusion, we pray in His name. Amen. All right, I'm back. Hi, guys. Sorry, the sermons are a lot longer when I'm back. Please remain seated for our offering.